Hello, I'm Daniel Chiba, and me and my teammate are going to present our project Binaries Can't Return. So malicious control flow redirections form the majority of software vulnerabilities or and attacks. And so there are a number of control flow integrity enforcements which can thwart such attacks, but these rely on compile time knowledge of every possible branch destination, and we don't always have that information. In particular, indirect control flow instructions depend on destination addresses which are stored in memory. And it's these memory locations that are easier for an attacker to actually modify. And so these instructions are still vulnerable because we can't always enforce CFI in those cases. Primary examples of these are indirect calls, which usually arise from function pointers, indirect jumps, and by far the most prevalent of these are returns. And so returns, a RET instruction, essentially what it does is pop an address from the top of the stack and jump to that address. And that's quite vulnerable because buffer overflow vulnerabilities allow the attacker to overwrite that address at the top of the stack. And once that address is compromised, the attacker can use return-oriented programming to run any arbitrary code that he or she wants to. And so our focus in this project is to remove returns from binaries that we create. The idea and the techniques that we present were all inspired by this paper, which was presented at CGO 2015. So I mentioned that attackers generally attempt buffer overflows to overwrite addresses in memory, but it's a lot harder to modify program code. And so an assumption that we make here, which is a pretty safe assumption, is that the attacker is unable to modify the code. And since our implementation, in our implementation, the returns jump to addresses that are in program memory, we are not vulnerable to such attacks as far as returns go. So let's move on to the implementation. So we use a combination of LLVM and Python. So Python is where we actually modify the assembly files. And before we can do that, we run an analysis pass using LLVM to get a call graph. And this is necessary for tail call analysis. And in case you're wondering why we don't just use LLVM to modify IR code, that's because LLVM what we are attempting to do is replace a return with a direct jump to the address following a call instruction. And usually those call instructions are going to be in different functions, and LLVM disallows branch instructions in IR whose destinations are in different functions. So we can't perform this modification using LLVM IR. But we do still use LLVM to get the call graph. And then we use this call graph to within our Python script, and perform the following modifications. First, we add labels to instructions immediately following call sites, and then we replace each RET instruction by with conditional jumps, direct jumps to valid labels only. If none of the comparisons succeed, then we know that the stack memory has been compromised by an attacker who is most likely attempting to return to code that we don't intend. And so we just call the exit function in that case. And this is going to be a lot clearer with a concrete example. So let's take a look at this. Right, so this is our assembly that's generated by Clang. And you see here the RET instruction is replaced by first an increment to the stack pointer by 8 bytes. It's 64-bit machine. And then we compare that address that was at the top of the stack. Obviously, so just a little bit of background, a call instruction will push the address of the next instruction onto the stack. And so that's what we compare here with a valid return site label. If that comparison succeeds, we do a direct jump to that address, which is immediately following the call site. If all of these comparisons fail, then we call the exit function because we know that the stack has been compromised. And these are the valid return site. So if you see, we're calling foo here, and so this would be one valid return site, and so on. So we could see that each RET, depending on the number of calls of potential caller functions, a RET could be replaced by a very large number of instructions. So that obviously has a negative performance impact. So a couple of possible optimizations. The first one, which is a simple optimization that we've applied, is for functions with a single call site, so only one potential caller. We jump directly to there's only one potential return site, and so we don't perform any comparisons. We simply increment the stack pointer and jump directly back to that address. A second optimization, which we haven't implemented, but we did evaluate using a contrived example, would be to order that the jump sled by frequency of invocation. So for example, if function A is called mostly by function B and very rarely by function C, then we make sure that the comparison and jump instruction to the return site in function B comes before the return site in function C. And that actually has a significant impact on performance, as we show in our micro benchmarks. We could, this would require profile guided optimization for real world benchmarks to achieve. And so these are the contrived micro benchmarks that we've come up with. If we start with the code snippet in the middle, the first thing to note is that both Clang, when it generates assembly, as well as our own Python script, when we modify that assembly, it goes from top to bottom. So as a result, when we insert our labels for potential return sites, we start with the return sites in bar. And so we'll have 10 return sites in bar, and the 11th return site will be to start. And bar is actually never invoked. We make sure that it doesn't get optimized out because we do all of our compilations with -O0. Otherwise, everything would be inlined and optimized out, and our demonstration would be meaningless. So we invoke foo a million times, and that's really all that's happening in each of these cases. And really what we want to evaluate is how long it takes to call foo and return from foo. And foo itself doesn't do anything but return a constant value. And so in this case, in eval2, the comparison that actually succeeds is going to be the last comparison. Whereas if you look at eval1, we've deliberately placed bar at the end after the start function where the evaluation is actually taking place. And so in this case, the successful comparison and jump happens almost immediately. It's just the only additional instruction. There are only two additional instructions in this case, which is the increment of the stack pointer and the comparison and the jump. So this corresponds to the second optimization that I mentioned here, which is ordering the frequency of ordering by frequency of invocation. The third case here would demonstrate the impact of the optimization that we implemented, which is a single call site. So foo is only being called in one place in our entire program. And so we don't need to perform any comparisons. We just directly jump to this return site. The results, as mentioned earlier, we invoke foo a million times, and we use the time utility to get our time. And so the first line here is for the program, the original unmodified program in each of the three cases. And over here, we have our modified program that doesn't contain any RETs. So we can see clearly that if there are a large number of potential return sites, the performance is significantly impacted. This takes double the amount of time. And so ordering them by frequency of invocation would have a huge performance benefit. And this is actually shown by the original CGO paper as well. And obviously the single call site optimization also has a huge impact. And so to conclude, we've successfully removed all RETs from the program, and we've evaluated the impact on performance as well as the impact that potential optimizations can provide. Thank you.